Hello, my name's Edward Probert. This is the weekly reflection from Salisbury Cathedral, where I'm the Canon Chancellor. You'll have to excuse me if I appear a bit disconcerted, and if I'm starting this a touch late this afternoon. I've just normally done what I normally do for these reflections, which is to record this on my iPad. And I just got up YouTube on my iPad, and it told me it was downloading a new version. So I've had to switch abruptly a couple of moments ago onto my iPhone. So I apologise for that. However, I trust this is working reasonably normally. We at Evensong in the last few weeks have had a series of very long first readings, Old Testament readings, from the book of the prophet Jeremiah. More or less a chapter at a time, really substantial texts. And these have brought us the events of the fall of Jerusalem and the prophet Jeremiah's tangential part in all of that, in the year 586 BC. That's a very, very long time ago, more than 2,500 years ago, 2,600 years ago. These are long, rather complex and detailed accounts of the events in that city, events involving a great deal of fear, as the city is repeatedly besieged by the forces of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. All the political manoeuvring within the city itself in the face of these fears. When the city is captured, then it's looted. There are repeated deportations, puppet regimes are set up, there are assassinations. It's full of the horrors, really. It's very familiar sounding. Throughout my lifetime, I can think of many comparable events that have happened much more recently in time. And indeed, as we all can, we have today's reminder, this week's reminder, that it's 6 months since the Russians invaded their neighbour Ukraine. And this today is the anniversary of their achieved and still protected, if partial, independence from Russia. I happened to be reading this morning an article about a family in Mariupol whose lives got caught up in the horrors of the Russian onslaught there, and the more or less total destruction of that city. It certainly involved the total destruction of their home, and they're getting trapped inside Mariupol as the city was completely encircled by the invading force, and as the shelling and fighting between the two parties resulted in not only their loss of their home, their exile to another neighbouring state, but also the blinding in one eye of the son, a 16-year-old, and the loss of one of his fingers. And his father, meanwhile, also suffered accidental damage from a blast nearby. This kind of thing is writ large across Ukraine and other war zones. And every time I hear this kind of thing, I'm reminded of a phrase that my former colleague Jeremy Davies often used in his prayers at Evensong, a prayer which referred to, and the phrase, active phrase in my mind, prayer that referred to the cruelties and miseries of war. It's a phrase that comes back to me because cruelties and miseries of war sums it up so very well. in 5 words. Well, coincidentally, today I was on duty representing my colleagues at the weekly hours-long vigil for the Ukraine, which we hold in the Cathedral on Wednesdays between 12:30 and 1:30. And as it happens today, I and 2 members of the Cathedral congregation sat for that hour in the St Margaret Chapel in the south transept, more or less facing each other. We sat there in silence for the whole of that hour. And as we did so, the cathedral's ordinary life passed us by. Parties of visitors came and went. Some of those passing by noticed the notices that are up in that chapel, inviting people to pray for Ukraine, maybe light a candle. Some stood there and read the notice, read the prayer, some lit a candle. These things were going on to the side of my vision and hearing, but Trevor and Susan and I simply sat there in silence. Well, 60 minutes, as you'll know if you've ever sat somewhere for 60 minutes, is a very long time. In fact, the first 3 or 4 minutes seem like a tremendously long time. There is, in that vigil, as in any such event of silent prayer, there is nothing to do. There's no prayers to say. There's nothing particular to read. The endeavour is to keep one's mind focused and to prevent it from wandering. Now, over the last 6 months, as we've held these vigils, I have done this quite a number of times now, and my colleagues will equally. And over time, I've sought to keep that focus to a degree by turning my eyes to a single item of furniture or a single pane of stained glass or some particular architectural feature. It's very easy when all of this life is going on to be distracted. It's very easy if you shut your eyes to doze off for a few minutes. Keeping my eyes focused at some point, but as it were, distractedly focused, is helpful to me. But of course what it means is that one's eye gets distracted by the details that I'm noticing now for the first time in this building as I've sat for several hours looking at things I've never had cause to look at until the last few months. 6 months, 60 minutes. These 60 minutes I spent at lunchtime and my friends with me, there's nothing to show for them. There's no measurable output of what we've done. We haven't achieved anything. You might well ask why we bother. Well, it's actually not an easy question to answer. And the only answers I can give are, on the one hand, that 6 months is a very, very long time by comparison with those 60 minutes. 6 months during which the cruelties and miseries of war, in Jeremy's phrase, have been multiplied and still with no end in sight. These 60-minute vigils are there to keep those current tragedies day by day happening in a place not so very far away and in many others besides, to keep them in sight and mind, symptomatic of so much that is horribly wrong in human life, and has been since long before Jeremiah and his people. The other thing is that these were 60 minutes not about what I could get done, or what I might have done if I hadn't been sitting in the cathedral in silence. Those 60 minutes for me and for Susan and Trevor and for others who've taken part are simply about being, and being actually impotent, powerless in that place before God. It's a hard thing sometimes to accept that we have no agency, that we cannot achieve something. I quoted my friend and colleague, former colleague Jeremy. I'm going to quote something else which I quote and have continued to quote throughout many decades, because again I think it sums up something of profound importance, put better than I've ever heard it put by anyone else. This is the last phrase of John Milton's sonnet number 16, when he agonises over what he might have been able to do if he had had his eyesight again. His last line: "They also serve who only stand and wait." Thank you for listening. I'll see you again soon sometime. Please pray for Ukraine.